For those who follow the world of mixed martial arts, Jorge "Gamebred" Masvidal is a well-known fighter. Some go as far to say that he's one of the most underrated fighters in combat sports. Currently, he competes in the welterweight division of the UFC and has been fighting professionally since 2003. Over his 20-year career, he's built a name for himself in the world of mixed martial arts. In his UFC career, he's established a 35-16-0 record. Many have also said that his fights are among the most entertaining to watch. His fight against Brazilian mixed martial artist Gilbert Burns garnered a lot of attention and excitement. The fight sparked conversations about Masvidal and rumors of his potential retirement from the sport. The fight also had other pros and experts in the industry talking about Masvidal's abilities as a fighter. Here are the pros revealing just how good Jorge Masvidal is. The first pro to talk about Jorge Masvidal's talent in the ring is a fixture in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. That expert is none other than Joe Rogan. Rogan, who is a popular podcast host and UFC commentator, has spoken about Masvidal in detail. In one of the episodes of his podcast, he spoke with country singer Luke Combs about some of the UFC's greatest fighters. The conversation naturally turned to Masvidal. Although the American MMA fighter has never held a championship title in the UFC, Rogan said he's one of the best. The commentator and podcaster said that Masvidal is just on another level, even compared to greats like Georges St-Pierre. Rogan described him as an assassin and a gangster, citing the fighter's iconic knockouts against Ben Askren and Yves Edwards. Combs asked the podcast host to clarify his earlier point, and Rogan doubled down, stating that Masvidal could take on St-Pierre in his prime. This is a huge claim. GSP is widely regarded as one of the best MMA fighters of all time. In the debate about who the best mixed martial artist of all time is, his name often comes up. During his career, GSP boasted a 26-2 record, and his only defeats were against Matt Hughes and Matt Serra. The Canadian fighter beat them later in rematches and reigned over the welterweight division. Because of his victories in those rematches, GSP has beaten every fighter he's been matched up against. St-Pierre also made 9 defenses of his title before stepping away from the sport in 2013. There are claims that he is one of the best to ever step foot in the octagon. Naturally, this claim caused a lot of backlash toward Rogan. Many argue that the commentator was showing bias towards Masvidal. Considering the two fighters' records, the backlash makes sense. But Rogan also had a point in saying that mixed martial arts has evolved, and fighters have probably improved over time. Masvidal has definitely demonstrated some talent in the ring. It says a lot that Rogan, who has commented on his fair share of fights in the ring, would immediately compare him to one of the best. The commentator has been part of the combat sports world for decades. He saw the talent in Masvidal and drew that comparison. The American mixed martial artist later responded to the comment, praising Rogan and thanking him for the high praise. In an interview with MMA Junkie Radio, he called the commentator an encyclopedia of wealth for the sport. He cited a conversation the two recently had where Masvidal would bring up fighters' names and Rogan would talk about them in depth. He continued to lay out his admiration for the commentator as a connoisseur of the sport. He said it was an honor to be considered one of the greatest fighters ever by the UFC commentator. Another pro who's talked about Masvidal's strengths as a fighter is Gilbert Burns. That's right. The fighter who dominated him has positive things to say about Masvidal, in addition to smack talk, of course. When the fight was announced, many asked Burns what his thoughts were on the matchup. When asked if he was excited about the fight, Burns spoke positively of Masvidal, saying he has a lot of fights under his belt, with 51 matches and even more that aren't on his record. Burns also cited that Masvidal has solid striking, a lot of knockouts, and is all around dangerous. Burns was also asked if he felt comfortable going into the fight because of Masvidal's recent losing streak. The Brazilian fighter said that doesn't make it easier. He explained that Masvidal is still a big name and a strong fighter. He cited that the losses probably make him hungry for the win, and he seems like the kind of fighter who can handle pressure. That just goes to show you how much respect and reverence these fighters have for each other. They are open to publicly recognizing each other's strengths and talents before stepping into the ring. This just further demonstrates the name and recognition Masvidal has built for himself in the league. Next up, we'll be covering an interview where two pros discuss Masvidal. Those two are former UFC fighters Daniel Cormier and Ben Askren. Cormier had Askren to come onto his YouTube channel to discuss the then upcoming match between Jorge Masvidal and Gilbert Burns. Before we get into that interview, let's focus on something Cormier brought up in an earlier conversation. Cormier had previously acknowledged that this was a make-or-break fight for Masvidal. He said that with Masvidal falling in the ranks, he had to win in order to be taken seriously in the league again. Cormier went on to explain that Masvidal was in a position where he had to prove himself. He acknowledged that Masvidal used to be able to hang with the best of them, but his losing streak might indicate that he's losing his edge. Despite the negative outlook on Masvidal's chances and current state as a fighter, he still acknowledged that Masvidal had reached top-tier status. When Cormier brought that point up in his conversation with Askren, the guest actually defended Masvidal. He made a note that in some cases, fighters will drop in rank if they don't take fights frequently enough. He also said that when you look at Masvidal's recent losses, he'd only lost to Colby Covington and Kamaru Usman. Askren suggested they're top-level fighters, so Masvidal isn't necessarily a worse fighter because he lost to them. Askren has fought Masvidal before and knows firsthand just how efficient the fighter can be. In fact, in Masvidal's fight with Askren, he set the record for the fastest knockout in UFC history with a flying knee. The fight only lasted 5 seconds.
The fight clock is brought to you by Modelo.
In some ways, you could say luck contributed to the famous record-holding knockout. Askren himself says that Masvidal was very lucky to get that knockout the way he did. But that also demonstrates a level of technical skill and strength on Masvidal's part. The two former fighters weren't sure Masvidal would win the fight against Burns. However, they both acknowledged that he has the skills and was previously at that level. He just had to prove that he's still able to take on stronger fighters in the league. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case in this highly anticipated bout. Masvidal suffered his fourth loss via a unanimous decision against Burns at UFC 287. This loss was the catalyst for his retirement, saying that he hadn't felt the same as when he first started his career 20 years ago. There were those who were skeptical of Masvidal and his odds of coming out on top at UFC 287. They recognized that Masvidal is a big name with a lot of strength and experience, but they didn't see that translating into his most recent bouts. Thus, it was doubtful he'd pull through. But there are still pros who see him as a threat to the competition. Some of those pros still consider him a top contender in the league, and they know just how good Jorge Masvidal is. This was everything the pros had to say about how good Jorge Masvidal is.